It was one of those nights that felt suspended, where the air seemed heavier than usual, and the quiet carried its own weight, the kind of quiet that forces you to listen, even when you don't want to. I had been leaning against the railing of the old wooden balcony, a glass of wine in my hand, watching the dim lights from the chalets across the clearing flicker. There was a chill brushing against my neck, the wind carrying the faint smell of wet pine and smoke from a distant fireplace. That's when I noticed her, Claire, standing a few feet away, her silhouette outlined by the soft glow of a single lantern. She was looking down at the wooden planks beneath her feet, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. It wasn't the kind of nervousness I had seen before, the one that comes from shyness or uncertainty in a social crowd. This was something quieter, more pressing, as if the world outside that balcony had already been pulled away from her. And then she said it, almost as if testing the words on her tongue. "It's the last night before I leave," she whispered. The sentence lingered between us, weighty but fragile. I didn't immediately answer. I didn't need to. I watched her shoulders tense slightly, then relax, the way someone does when they confess something without expecting a reply. I could feel the urgency behind her words, not desperate, not pleading, but real enough to leave a trace of unease in the cold night. I took a slow sip from, letting the wine anchor me in the moment before I spoke. "Then I'll make you stay," I said, my voice even, deliberate, offering no apology for the certainty. Her head lifted just a fraction, a flicker of surprise crossing her features. Not shock, not disbelief, something softer, something that might have been hope, if hope had been careful enough not to break easily. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply turned her gaze toward the stars, leaving the question floating between us, unanswered, as if the night itself were holding its breath. I stepped a little closer, not to crowd her, but just enough to let her know that my presence wasn't a suggestion. I had no intentions of forcing this, no illusions of dramatic gestures or grand declarations. I simply stayed, letting the quiet of the night and the space between us do what words could not. We didn't speak again for several minutes. The wind whispered through the pine, rustling the lantern's light and casting shadows that danced like slow memories across the wooden planks. Every now and then, she glanced at me, just enough for me to catch the tension in her hands, the slight tremor in her lips, the way her breath caught ever so slightly. Vulnerability, yes, but not weakness. More like an admission of survival, a small concession that the world outside might be harsher than what we allowed ourselves to hold here, together. At some point, without realizing it, we began to walk, not toward anything in particular, just along the balcony, the boards creaking beneath our feet, each step measured but unhurried. The night seemed to stretch around us, thick and comfortable, and I could feel the subtle pull of her attention, her curiosity edging toward trust. She didn't speak, and I didn't need her to. The moment itself was speaking. By the time we reached the far end of the balcony, where the shadows pooled darker and the lantern's glow barely reached, I knew something unspoken had begun. A thread had formed between us, fragile, careful, yet undeniable. It didn't promise certainty or closeness, not yet, but it promised presence. And in that quiet, suspended hour, presence was enough. She finally broke the silence, her voice just above the whisper of the wind. "I don't know if I should have said that." "You did," I replied simply, "and now it's here, and that's enough." She didn't answer. She let her gaze fall to the edge of the balcony, and I could feel her mind wrestling with the distance she was planning to cross tomorrow. And yet, just as I had promised, I remained, steady, calm, unyielding, a quiet anchor in the shifting tides of her uncertainty. And for the first time that evening, I noticed her breathing relax. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that the night seemed less like a countdown and more like a beginning. The morning after, the world felt unusually quiet. Sunlight filtered through the pine trees, casting long, golden stripes across the cabin floor. I found Claire in the kitchen, sitting on a stool by the counter, absently stirring a cup of coffee. She hadn't looked at me, her eyes fixed on the swirling liquid as if the steam carried some secret she needed to decipher. I leaned against the doorway, neither wanting to startle her nor force conversation. The room smelled faintly of toasted bread and pine needle, and the occasional chirp of birds outside was oddly loud, breaking the silence in uneven bursts. I watched her shoulders, relaxed yet taut, and wondered if her mind was replaying last night, the words she had whispered, the promise I had offered. She didn't speak, and I didn't either. We existed in parallel motions for several minutes, a quiet ballet of proximity without intrusion. Eventually, I poured myself some coffee and took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in my chest. She glanced up then, just briefly, and offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. That was enough for me to move closer, settling on the opposite stool with my own cup. "I didn't think you'd stay up on the balcony last night," she said finally, her voice low, careful. "I didn't think I'd leave either," I replied, letting the words fall between us without emphasis. There was no pressure, no hidden meaning beyond the truth. I had stayed because it felt right, because she had needed a presence that wasn't loud or demanding. She nodded once, a quick dip of her head, then returned to her cup. For a moment, the silence grew heavy again, not uncomfortable, but filled with the awareness of something unspoken. I decided not to break it. I simply sipped my coffee, feeling the steam on my face, and allowed the space to exist. Minutes passed. Then she said, softly, "I always feel like I have to be moving, even when I don't know where I'm going." Her words were casual, but her fingers gripped the cup tightly. There was vulnerability there, a crack in the armor she carried so carefully. I didn't respond immediately. I let her voice settle in the room, echoing quietly. "You don't have to move all the time," I finally said. "It's okay to just be, even for a little while." Her gaze lifted to meet mine, and for the first time that morning, it didn't flick away. There was hesitation, a small glimmer of consideration in her expression, as if she were testing whether my words carried weight or were simply polite air. I held her eyes steadily, neither pressing nor retreating. The day unfolded in small, unplanned motion. We moved around the cabin, making breakfast together, washing dishes in silence, occasionally exchanging quiet observations about the forest outside. Each gesture, mundane on its own, carried subtle significance. Passing a towel, adjusting a chair, leaving a window open to breathe. Without realizing it, the distance that had defined her urgency the night before began to shrink, replaced by an understanding that didn't need explanation. In the afternoon, she asked me to join her for a walk through the pine grove. I didn't hesitate. We moved slowly, letting the uneven path guide us. The conversation was minimal, punctuated by pauses that felt intentional, deliberate. I noticed her glance at the light filtering through the branches, the way her shoulders relaxed with each step, the quiet sigh she couldn't quite suppress when a bird took flight over. By the time we returned to the cabin, a rhythm had begun to form, quiet, steady, unhurried, no words of promise, no overt declarations, just presence, acknowledgement, and the slow building of trust. Something small, fragile, yet undeniable, had begun to exist between us, and it was enough. The sun had climbed higher by the time Claire finally spoke about leaving. We were seated on the back porch, the wind lighter than the night before, carrying hints of pine and the faint aroma of the cabin's wood smoke. She had a folder open on her lap, filled with papers, some marked with notes, others blank. The edges were frayed, as though they had traveled farther than she had. "I'm moving," she said, almost in passing, though her voice trembled slightly. "Next week, another city, new apartment, new job, everything." I didn't respond right away. I simply watched her, noticing the way her hands clutched the folder, as if it could anchor her to this moment, to this place. Her eyes avoided mine, darting to the horizon, to the trees, to anything but the space between us. "I thought it would feel exciting," she admitted, her voice softer now, more vulnerable. "But it doesn't. It just feels like leaving." She exhaled slowly, as if letting some weight escape with her breath. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just enough for her words to settle. "Leaving can be complicated," I said finally, choosing my tone carefully. "Sometimes it's not about excitement, it's about necessity." She nodded, but it was an empty gesture, one of acknowledgement rather than understanding. There was more behind her eyes, a hesitation I couldn't ignore. I didn't probe, didn't offer advice. I simply allowed her to exist in that tension, offering presence without intrusion. "I don't want to be alone," she confessed after a moment, almost too quietly. The words were raw, unpolished, and carried a weight that made the air between us denser. She didn't look at me, but I felt the weight of the confession settle into the space I occupied. "You won't be," I said softly, "not while I'm here." A brief glance at me, her expression flickering with something, uncertainty, relief, curiosity. She didn't respond, merely traced the edge of the folder with her fingers, twisting it in ways that revealed her anxiety. She was balancing the tension between her fears and her obligations, between her independence and the fragile wish to trust someone. We spent the next hour in silence, punctuated by small gestures. I passed her a cup of coffee. She let her gaze linger on the mountains beyond the porch. I noticed the way her posture relaxed incrementally, the stiffness in her shoulders softening, though ever so slightly. Later, we wandered through the nearby trail, footsteps soft on the pine needles. She walked beside me, keeping a careful distance, yet remaining within reach. Occasionally, she would pause to observe the sunlight striking a branch or the flutter of a bird's wings, her mind seemingly elsewhere yet tethered to the moment. I noticed her hesitation, the way she measured each step, as if testing whether she could belong in the present without being swept away by the future. I didn't push her, didn't offer solutions. I simply walked beside her, letting my calm presence be a quiet assurance. By the time we returned to the cabin, A subtle shift had occurred. Claire's expression, still guarded, carried a trace of something I had come to recognize. Tentative trust. It wasn't complete, not even close, but it was enough to suggest that the distance she was planning to cross might not be traversed alone. And I stayed, steady and patient, knowing that the promise of presence, unspoken but felt, was more powerful than words could ever be. We woke to a morning that smelled of damp earth and pine needle. Claire was already awake when I stepped out onto the porch, her hair pulled into a loose knot, a notebook resting open on her lap. The way she stared at it suggested she wasn't reading. Not exactly. She was thinking, untangling thoughts that hadn't yet found words. "I made a list," she said, without looking up, her voice low, almost conversational, yet carrying a weight that made it more than casual. "Things I want to do before I leave." I settled into the chair beside her, careful not to crowd her. "May I see it?" She handed me the notebook. It wasn't neat. Lines ran at odd angles, words scratched out, notes scribbled in margins. I read silently, walk to the lake, watch the sunrise, listen to music without talking, share a meal outside, leave a note for someone I care about. Nothing grand, nothing elaborate, just small, deliberate moments she wanted to hold before the world pulled her away. "Mind if I join?" I asked. My tone carried no insistence, no expectation. I wasn't offering to rewrite her list or take ownership of her time. I simply wanted to walk alongside her, silently or not, while she did these small things. She looked up finally, surprise in her eyes. Then, slowly, a tentative smile. "I think I'd like that." The morning passed without urgency. We walked to the lake, the path soft underfoot with fallen pine needle. She pointed out a bird on a branch, and I watched her watch it, noting the quiet wonder in her gaze. We didn't speak much. Conversation seemed unnecessary. Presence was enough. Later, we found a fallen log and sat, listening to the water ripple against the shore. She hummed a tune softly, a fragment of a song she loved, and I hummed along, careful not to overtake her melody. The small harmony was enough to fill the silence comfortably. For lunch, we prepared sandwiches in the cabin kitchen, laughing quietly when a slice of cheese fell onto the floor. I didn't offer to replace it immediately. She picked it up herself, a simple act of independence, and the way she smiled when she set it back on the plate spoke volumes. I had no desire to fix anything for her that she could manage on her own. I merely wanted to witness it, to recognize her autonomy while remaining present. By mid-afternoon, the shadows had lengthened across the forest floor, and we returned to the cabin, feet dusted with pine and earth. Claire's notebook lay open on the counter, a list half completed, but more importantly, alive. She looked at me, her expression quiet, thoughtful. "You know," she said, "I didn't think anyone would care to do these things with me." I shrugged lightly, letting a small smile ease onto my face. "I'm not anyone, and I do." The words hung in the air between us. Simple, yet potent. We weren't making promises. We weren't sealing a future. But in that moment, in the execution of small, deliberate acts, a fragile bond had to form, one that didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations to exist. And that was enough. By late afternoon, the sun had softened, casting long, golden streaks across the forest floor. Claire was arranging books on a small shelf in the cabin, her movements deliberate, almost hesitant. I had noticed, over the past few days, that she approached everything with careful measurement, as if the world demanded precision in order to feel safe. I stayed nearby, not offering help unless she asked, simply existing as a steady presence. "You don't have to finish that right now," I said softly, watching her place a worn notebook in its spot. "I know," she replied, not looking up, "but I feel like I should. Like if I leave something unfinished, it'll follow me." I understood, even if her fear wasn't entirely logical. "Sometimes leaving things unfinished gives you room to come back," I said, keeping my tone even. No pressure, no insistence. Just a statement, a subtle invitation to consider a different perspective. She paused, fingers brushing the edge of the shelf. Her eyes flicked toward me, a brief, searching look. "And if I can't come back, you can," I said simply, as if the certainty of my words could fill the space her doubt had carved out. There was no force behind them, only steady resolve. "But even if you choose to go, that doesn't mean you have to go alone." "Not while I'm here." The shift in her posture was subtle, but telling. Her shoulders relaxed fractionally, the tension in her hands easing. We didn't need to speak further. I remained, just a calm presence beside her, the kind that doesn't demand or question, simply holds space. Later, we walked along the forest path again. This time, she carried her journal loosely in her hands, not writing, not reading, simply holding it as one might hold a small, fragile companion. The trail was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft crunch of our footsteps. She didn't say much, only observed the sunlight filtering through the canopy, the way it scattered across the moss-covered ground. At a small clearing, we stopped. Claire traced patterns in the dirt with her fingers, hesitant, deliberate. I stood beside her, not pressing, not intruding. The silence between us was not empty. It was filled with an understanding that had been growing quietly, day by day. "You've stayed," she said finally, her voice low. "Even when I haven't asked you to, even when I probably should have pushed you away." "I stayed," I replied, "because it seemed right, because presence matters more than words sometimes." She nodded, a small, slow gesture, and in that moment, I realized that the bond we were forming didn't need urgency or declaration. It didn't need promises shouted into the wind. It existed quietly, in gestures, in choices, in being there without expectation. When we returned to the cabin, she lingered at the threshold, looking back at the path we had walked. I could see the flicker of consideration in her eyes, the subtle weighing of fear against trust. She didn't speak, didn't ask, but her pause was a signal, a small acknowledgement that the presence I offered was becoming something she might lean on, something she might choose. The rain began quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, tapping lightly against the cabin roof. By the time Claire and I stepped onto the trail, the drops had thickened into a soft, constant drizzle. The forest smelled richer, earthy and damp, and the air felt cooler against our skin. Claire walked a step behind me, her hood pulled loosely over her hair, glancing sideways at the wet trail with cautious steps. "I don't usually tell people this," she said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the rain, "but I've been burned before. I mean, I let someone in once, and the moment I needed them most, they weren't there." I didn't respond immediately. I let the words sink, let the rhythm of the rain fill the space between us. I knew she wasn't asking for advice. Not exactly. She was testing whether the world still held any safety, and whether the presence beside her could be trusted to remain. "I see," I said finally, softly. "That must have been hard." She exhaled, the sound mixing with the rain. I thought I knew what trust was, but it was all illusions. And now, every time I try to, I don't know, open up, there's this caution that won't leave me. I kept walking beside her, not reaching to touch, not insisting on reassurance. My calm presence was the only answer she needed for now. "Caution isn't wrong," I said. "It's a measure of self-preservation, but it doesn't have to define every step you take." Her gaze flicked toward me, then back at the rain-soaked trail. She said nothing for several moments, just let the drizzle run over her face, soaking through the fabric of her sweater. I noticed the tension in her hands, fingers curling into the pockets of her jeans, the faint tremor that betrayed how much her words had cost her. I don't even know why I'm telling you this," she admitted, voice cracking slightly. "Maybe because I feel like I can." "You can," I said simply. "You always can, and you don't need to justify it. I'll listen." She stopped walking for a moment, letting the rain fall freely over her shoulders. Then, without making eye contact, she continued. "I guess I've been trying to figure out if I can trust myself, and then, maybe, if I can trust someone else." We walked in silence after that, the only sound the steady patter of rain on leaves and earth. I didn't offer empty comfort. I didn't promise her anything. I simply stayed beside her, steady and unwavering, letting the moment stretch without urgency. By the time we returned to the cabin, our clothes damp, hair sticking lightly to our skin, I could feel a subtle shift in her posture. Less tension, less hesitancy, not complete trust, far from it, but the faintest glimmer that someone could exist beside her without vanishing when the storm came. She lingered at the doorway, breathing deeply, the rain dripping from her. "Thank you," she murmured, almost inaudibly. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "I'm here, that's all." She smiled faintly, and I knew that in the quiet aftermath of the rain, a fragile understanding had begun to take root. One that didn't need declarations, only presence. The afternoon sun had begun to soften when I returned to the cabin after a brief walk to gather kindling. Claire was already inside, standing by the stove, her hands moving deftly over the pans as she prepared a simple meal. There was a quiet concentration in her, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but draws it nonetheless. I leaned against the doorway, observing her, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly, hand shifted, or a utensil slipped. "Need a hand?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head without looking. "I've got it." I stepped closer anyway, carrying the basket of kindling, placing it neatly by the fireplace. The act was small, almost insignificant, yet it allowed her to glance my way, just for a moment, before returning to her task. We worked in parallel, not in conversation, not in silence, but in the quiet rhythm of shared purpose. Occasionally, I would hand her something, a knife, a plate, a wooden spoon, and she would take it with a small nod, her eyes catching mine briefly. There was trust forming in those glances, subtle, hesitant, but undeniable. Later, we ate at the small table by the window, the sky outside tinged with orange and purple. The meal was simple, yet somehow, in that room with the lights casting soft halos over the walls, it felt significant. She tasted the food, occasionally offering small comments, and I responded with the minimal words necessary to keep the conversation flowing without forcing it. At one point, I noticed her looking at the corner of the room where I had left the fireplace tools neatly arranged. "You have a way of making this place feel homey," she said softly, almost to herself. I didn't answer immediately, simply letting the words settle. "Maybe it's because home isn't about the things," I said finally. "It's about the presence, the people you choose to stay around." Her gaze lifted to me, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a mixture of reflection and quiet surprise. She didn't respond verbally. Instead, she returned her attention to her plate, but her fingers lingered a little longer over the edge of the table, and I sensed a subtle easing of the tension she carried. After dinner, we moved to the living area, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the. Claire lingered near the window, looking out, and I sat in the chair across from her. I noticed her shoulders relax incrementally, her posture softening as the quiet of the cabin settled over us. "You know," she murmured, almost hesitantly, "you have a smell, like a place where it's safe to stay." "Not everyone has that." I offered a small smile, letting the comment rest between us without embellishment. Presence, not words. That's what she was acknowledging. That's what had begun to shape the space around us. The sense that someone could simply exist beside her without expectation, without drama, without pressure. The night deepened, and the rain from earlier had left the air crisp, carrying the scent of wet pine through the open window. We didn't move closer. We didn't need to. The comfort was in the shared quiet, the understanding that each of us had begun to find something rare, the promise of steady presence, soft and unyielding, like the walls of the cabin themselves. The morning carried a quiet way. Sunlight spilled across the cabin floor, but Claire seemed distant, preoccupied, moving between her belongings with a meticulous care that bordered on ritual. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half-packed, its edges fraying slightly, the fabric worn from travel. She had been going through it for the better part of the hour, folding clothes, refolding them, hesitating, then adjusting once more. I watched from the doorway, careful not to intrude, noting the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor as she rearranged items. It wasn't just a suitcase. It was a boundary she had set between herself and the world, and between herself and the fleeting sense of comfort she had allowed to grow here. "You're not leaving until you have to," I said, my voice steady, neutral, no judgment, no insistence, just observation. She paused mid-fold, her eyes flicking toward me, unsure, searching. I don't know if I should," she murmured, almost to herself. "I mean, everything's ready. It's all planned. But," her words faltered. I stepped closer, just enough to offer presence without imposing. "Do you want to go?" I asked softly. "Or are you doing it because you think it's expected?" Her hands froze over the edge of the suitcase. She didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched long enough that the room felt smaller, tighter, charged with unspoken possibility. Finally, she exhaled, a slow, deliberate release of the tension she had been holding in her chest. I think I've been leaving because I always leave," she admitted. Her voice wavered, yet there was honesty in it that made the space between us feel lighter, even as it trembled with vulnerability. "You don't have to leave this time," I said. The words weren't a command. They weren't an insistence. They were simply a recognition of choice, a quiet offering of autonomy paired with unwavering support. Her eyes met mine then, lingering longer than they had in days. Something flickered in that gaze, a mixture of uncertainty, reflection, and the faintest trace of hope. She looked at the suitcase again, then at the floor, and for the first time, she hesitated without reaching for it. We spent the next hour together in the small room, not speaking much, letting her move at her own pace. I carried small tasks, straightening a rug, arranging books, tidying the counter. My presence was steady, silent, a constant she could lean on without needing to acknowledge it. Occasionally, she would glance up, offering a brief, tentative smile, and I would return it without ceremony. At one point, she folded the last shirt, set it atop the half-packed pile, and paused. "You've made this harder," she said softly, a wry note in her tone. "Because I feel like I could stay." "You can," I said simply. "It's your choice, not mine. But know this, I'll stay with it, with you, either way." Her lips curved into a small, genuine smile, fragile, yet real. She didn't speak after that, letting the silence stretch into something comfortable, something promising. The suitcase remained half-packed, but the weight of departure had shifted. For the first time in days, she seemed to consider the possibility of staying, of letting herself choose presence over habit, trust over fear. The morning was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Claire had already left the cabin when I woke, the bed cold and uninviting in her absence. The sun had risen fully, spilling a gentle light through the windows, but it failed to chase away the hollowness her absence left behind. I moved around the cabin, performing small tasks, folding the blankets, washing a few dishes, straightening the counter, each motion automatic, almost ritualistic. It wasn't until I noticed the small folded piece of paper on the pillow that the quiet shifted from empty to alive. Her handwriting was careful, measured, familiar in the way only someone present for several days can make themselves felt. I picked it up, holding it delicately between my fingers, as if handling something fragile and irreplaceable. The note was brief. She had written about the trip, about the work awaiting her, about the routine she was returning to. Yet there was an undercurrent, subtle, almost imperceptible, gratitude for the days, acknowledgement of the presence I had offered, a recognition of the quiet steadiness she had never expected to find. I sat on the edge of the bed, reading and rereading her words. I didn't feel disappointment. I felt something quieter, deeper. Presence doesn't vanish with distance. Connection doesn't evaporate because of miles. Her note confirmed it, in its own way, a promise wrapped in ink. I will think about this. I might come back. I folded the note carefully, placing it in my pocket. The rest of the morning passed with the measured rhythm I had grown accustomed to. A cup of coffee, the faint hum of the cabin settling around me, the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. I moved through each action deliberately, aware of the subtle space she had left behind, a space filled with the residue of trust, of tentative understanding, of something that had begun to grow between us. By afternoon, I wandered outside, letting the soft light guide me through the small forest clearing. The wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth, and I felt her absence keenly, yet without panic. Trust, after all, is a quiet thing. It doesn't demand constant affirmation. It exists in patience, in the knowledge that some bonds are slow to solidify but resilient once formed. I placed the note back on the pillow before leaving the cabin briefly, a symbolic gesture more than a necessity. When I returned, the cabin felt less empty somehow, as if her words alone had shifted the atmosphere, made it inhabitable again in her absence. It was a delicate balance, absence and presence intertwined, one that required no dramatic declarations, only the quiet patience of knowing that something meaningful had begun. That evening, I left the porch light on. It wasn't for her return, not directly. It was a signal, perhaps, to the world, and certainly to myself, that the cabin, and by extension, I, remained steadfast, that some doors, and some hearts, do not close completely, no matter how far someone steps away. Weeks had passed since Claire left the cabin, and in that time, I had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost ordinary. The mornings carried the same light, the forest rustled the same way, and yet the space she had left remained palpable, a presence that lingered like a gentle echo. I moved through each day with deliberate care, performing small tasks, listening to the wind, and letting the quiet stretch around me without filling it with expectation. It was late afternoon when she returned. I heard the door creak before I saw her, a familiar sound that jolted the stillness in the best way possible. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, suitcase nowhere in sight. The forest behind her seemed to frame her in a quiet certainty, a presence I had come to recognize as wholly her own. "Still got room on that sofa?" she asked, her voice calm, steady, though tinted with a hint of vulnerability. No apology, no justification, just a simple, careful question. I rose from my chair, heart steady but alert, and nodded. "Always," I said, "and in the rest too, if you want." She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The cabin felt warmer immediately, as though her return had shifted the atmosphere, smoothing the edges of absence that had settled there. I didn't move to embrace her, didn't reach for her hand. That wasn't necessary. She didn't need reassurance through touch. She needed acknowledgement of choice and presence, and the simple act of my being here had always provided that. We settled into the living area, the fading sun casting long shadows across the floor. Claire lingered near the window, observing the subtle changes the weeks had brought, the growth of moss along the edge of the porch, the way the light bent differently with the pines. I watched her quietly, noting the slight relaxation in her posture, the careful way she exhaled as if releasing old tension. She turned toward me after some minutes, her expression soft, thoughtful. "I wasn't sure. I didn't know if I could," she said. The pause between her words was heavy, laden with the weight of consideration and reflection. "You can," I replied simply. "You always could, and you know it now." She nodded slowly, letting the words settle. There was no urgency, no drama, no need for explanation. The quiet assurance between us was enough. She had returned not because of obligation or expectation, but because the space had been offered honestly and patiently, without pressure, without demand. The room grew dimmer as twilight approached. The lights of the cabin softened the shadows, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt complete. Claire moved toward the sofa, setting herself down with a small sigh of relief, the faintest smile curving her lips. I remained in my chair, steady, a witness to the subtle transformation her presence brought. We didn't speak much after that, and we didn't need to. The silence carried the weight of unspoken promises, of choices made and honored, of a bond quietly solidified through presence and patience. And in that stillness, I knew something important, something that would endure, not through declarations, but through deliberate, unwavering existence beside one another.